You know that feeling when you're just going about your day and then boom, out of nowhere, something happens that makes you realize just how vulnerable we are to the forces of nature.
Oh, yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
It's like that blue gum tree in Glenwood that just missed crushing a house. You hear a story like that,
Yeah.
and it really makes you think about the trees around your own home. Like, are we living under a potential time bomb? I mean, it's a pretty scary thought.
It really is, and it's a stark reminder that we need to be paying attention to the risks posed by trees, especially with the impacts of climate change and these increasingly intense storms. And that's exactly what we're diving deep into today, the often hidden battle to safeguard Durban's trees and ultimately ourselves from these threats.
Exactly right. And we're not just talking about some dry academic report here. We've been sifting through a ton of really compelling frontline information. Things like emergency dispatch logs from real events, and even some pretty dramatic rescue footage to uncover the kind of insights that usually stay behind the scenes.
Totally. And the goal of this deep dive is to equip you with the knowledge you need to understand which trees in Durban are most at risk. We want to debunk some of those dangerously flawed ideas about tree care that are floating around and give you actionable steps that you can actually take to protect your property and maybe even save a tree or two in the process.
Hmm.
We've looked at everything from risk maps and emergency response protocols to some seriously cutting edge protection experiments.
So much good stuff. Okay, so let's start unpacking this. Our sources keep flagging certain areas in Durban as being particularly high risk when it comes to trees failing during extreme weather, almost like ticking time bombs. Where should we be extra vigilant?
Well, one thing that our sources really highlight is just how localized these risks can be. We've pinpointed three key zones in Durban where specific environmental factors are amplifying the danger.
Okay, I'm listening.
First up, the Berea Ridge. The critical issue there is that exceptionally thin layer of topsoil, often less than a meter deep, that sits directly on top of this really impermeable sandstone.
Oh, wow. So basically no room for roots.
Yeah, it's a problem. This bedrock barrier actually prevents trees, especially those big, mature fig trees we see all over, from developing the deep anchoring taproots that they need to withstand strong winds. We're talking those 70 or 80-kilometer-an-hour winds. Without those deep roots, they become way more susceptible to being uprooted.
Right, because they just don't have a good grip. So shallow soil on solid rock recipe for disaster. What's the next hotspot?
Next up, we've got Umhlanga rocks. And the main culprit there is salt. That constant exposure to the salty air and even saltwater intrusion into the soil, over time, it weakens the very structure of the tree trunk, makes the wood brittle and prone to snapping.
So it's like internal corrosion almost.
Exactly. So even in storms that aren't record-breaking, the trees are more vulnerable to failure. And then our third high-risk zone is kloof.
Okay, and what's going on in Kloof?
Well, kloof presents a different kind of challenge. It's the sheer number of aging blue gum forests that are there. Now, blue gums are known for their really rapid growth, which is great for some things, but it also means they tend to have relatively shallow root systems compared to their height, and the wood can get quite brittle as they age.
Makes sense.
And many of these trees in kloof were planted decades ago and are now either at or even exceeding their natural lifespan. So you've got this combination of shallow roots, brittle wood in these really tall, old trees. It creates a seriously elevated risk of failure during strong winds.
Right, that's a recipe for disaster.
And our sources even mention this detailed risk map that visually highlights these zones across Durban so residents can really see where the potential trouble spots are.
So if you're listening and you happen to live in Berea, Umhlanga, or Kloof, paying close attention to the trees around your property is definitely a good idea. And speaking of paying attention, let's talk about those dramatic 2023 April floods. I mean, our sources include some real analysis of those emergency responses, and I can only imagine the conditions those arborists were working in.
Absolutely. The footage we've seen is intense. It gives you this visceral understanding of the challenges they faced. Much of the work had to be done at night in torrential rain and high winds. Talk about pressure.
Oh, I bet. And I understand it wasn't just chainsaws blazing everywhere, right? I mean, the footage showed some pretty impressive, almost surgical techniques being used.
You're right. We saw amazing examples of emergency cabling on some really significant fig trees. Picture this high-strength cables essentially acting as temporary guy wires to support weakened limbs and trunks. It buys the tree some time and prevents catastrophic failures.
Wow, that's amazing. Like a lifeline for a tree.
Exactly. And then there were also cases of really precise weight reduction cuts. This isn't just about randomly lopping off branches. It's a skilled process of carefully removing specific parts of the canopy to reduce the overall weight and wind resistance on those vulnerable sections of the tree.
Right, so not just hacking away at it, but really targeted strategic cuts.
Exactly. And then you mentioned this 4-point last chance salvage protocol.
Yeah, that sounds pretty intense.
It is. It's kind of a Hail Mary pass for really significant trees that have suffered major structural damage but are considered too valuable to lose, maybe because of their age or their species rarity or even historical importance.
Makes sense.
And while our sources don't detail all 4 points of the protocol, it generally involves a combination of intensive structural support. So things like extensive cabling and bracing, significant but targeted pruning to remove those most dangerous sections, ongoing monitoring of the tree's recovery, and often specific treatments to address any underlying health problems.
Wow. It's a whole team effort to save these special trees.
It really is. And it shows the dedication and expertise of those arborists working under extreme pressure.
Really impressive. Now let's talk about something that might surprise some of our listeners. We often hear advice to heavily prune trees before a big storm as a way to prepare. But our sources suggest this might actually backfire.
Yeah, this is a crucial point that goes against conventional wisdom. That idea of aggressively trimming trees before a storm thinking you're making them safer can actually make them more likely to fail.
Really? Okay, explain that.
So the thing is, when you heavily prune a tree, it often responds by producing a flush of new rapid growth at the tips of those remaining branches. This creates what we call top-heavy growth, a denser, heavier outer canopy with less supporting foliage underneath, kind of like a lollipop shape where all the weight is at the top. And that makes it much more likely to snap or be uprooted by the wind.
So you're essentially making it more vulnerable to the wind by trying to make it safer.
Exactly. And it gets worse. This heavy, indiscriminate pruning also removes essential inner foliage. This foliage actually helps to buffer the tree against wind and rain, acting as a natural windbreak.
Oh, interesting.
And perhaps most importantly, these superficial trims usually completely ignore the health and stability of the root system.
Which is kind of the most important part, right?
Absolutely. A strong, healthy root system is the foundation of a tree's ability to withstand storms, and simply hacking off branches does nothing to address underlying root problems like disease or compaction or inadequate anchorage.
So basically, we're treating the symptoms but not the cause.
Hmm.
So if we shouldn't be hacking away at our trees before a storm, what are some more effective ways to help them weather these events?
Good question. A much better approach is to focus on the long-term health and structural integrity of the tree. This means making sure they're properly watered and fertilized, addressing any signs of disease or pest infestation quickly, and doing regular moderate pruning to remove dead, damaged, or crossing branches.
Okay, so it's more about ongoing care than a last-minute intervention.
Precisely. This kind of maintenance helps to improve airflow through the canopy, which reduces wind resistance in a balanced way without triggering that problematic top-heavy growth. And as we saw in the emergency footage for trees with known weaknesses, proactive measures like cabling and bracing can provide targeted support to those vulnerable areas.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's about consistent, good care and targeted interventions rather than a last-minute chop-chop approach. Now, our sources also mentioned a really fascinating case study involving a lightning strike. It sounds like something that could easily be missed just by looking at the tree.
Absolutely. This was a case in Westville where a pine tree had been struck by lightning. From the outside, the tree seemed fine. The leaves were still green, no obvious cracks or splintering.
So it looked healthy.
Exactly. But the homeowner, being understandably concerned, wanted a professional arborist to check it out. And that's where the sonic tomography came into play.
Okay, now for our listeners who might not know, what is sonic tomography?
So sonic tomography is a really cool non-invasive way to look inside a tree. It uses sound waves to create kind of like an internal ultrasound image of the trunk. So by sending sound waves through the wood and measuring how they travel, arborists can detect hidden defects like decay cracks, or in this case, signs of lightning damage.
Wow, so it can reveal damage you can't even see. What did they find in this case?
Well, the sonic tomography revealed these hidden internal charcoal veins running through the wood, basically pathways where the intense electrical current from the lightning had traveled, burning the wood from the inside out. So while the tree looked healthy on the outside, its internal structure had been severely compromised.
Oh, wow. So it was a ticking time bomb just waiting to fall apart.
Exactly. And what made this case even more concerning was that kids played under this tree regularly. Without this advanced diagnostic tool, the danger would have remained completely hidden.
That's scary to think about. It
Mhm.
really highlights that you can't always judge a tree's health just by looking at it. Now, speaking of things you might not expect, our sources mention a trial of a really unconventional stormproofing method called Australian bushfire wrapping.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one.
So tell us, what is Australian bushfire wrapping?
So it's this experimental technique where they wrap the trunks and lower branches of trees in a fire-resistant material. The original idea was to protect them from the intense heat of bushfires, hence the name.
Right.
But researchers in Durban were curious if this wrapping might also provide some protection against extreme wind and rain.
Oh, interesting.
So they set up a trial comparing wrapped and unwrapped palm trees over 6 months to see what happened.
And you mentioned the results were surprising.
Yeah, well, our sources don't give us all the details, but the fact that they highlight the surprise suggests that the wrapped trees didn't perform quite as expected, or maybe there were some unforeseen negative effects from being wrapped for so long. Maybe issues with trapped moisture or restricted growth.
Right. So it wasn't the silver bullet they hoped for.
Exactly. It just goes to show that even seemingly simple solutions can have complex and unexpected consequences, and thorough testing is crucial.
So you can't just assume something that works in one extreme environment will automatically work in another. Okay, now let's get to some really practical information. Our sources named the 3 tree species that are most likely to fail in Durban storms, and apparently these are really common trees.
Right, this is essential information for everyone listening. Based on our analysis, the 3 species that are most vulnerable are the blue gum Eucalyptus grandis, the Indian almond Terminalia catapa, and the umbrella tree Schefflera actinophylla.
Okay, those names are a mouthful, but I bet a lot of people have those trees in their yards.
Absolutely. These 3 species are found in a staggering 82% of suburbs across Durban, so chances are you probably have at least one of these on or near your property.
Wow, 82%, that really puts it into perspective. So if you've got blue gums, Indian almonds, or umbrella trees in your yard, it's time to take a closer look. Now, another hazard that comes with severe storms is lightning. Our sources briefly touch on lightning protection systems for trees. Can you give us the rundown on those?
Sure. One of the biggest misconceptions is that a lightning protection system will prevent a tree from ever being struck by lightning.
Right, I think a lot of people assume that.
Yeah, but in reality, these systems are designed to provide a safe, controlled path for that electrical current to travel down to the ground. So it minimizes damage to the tree itself and importantly reduces the risk of the lightning spreading to nearby buildings or starting a fire.
So it's about managing the energy of the strike rather than preventing it altogether.
Exactly. Another common misunderstanding is that only the tallest trees need protection.
Yeah, that makes sense, but it's not always the case,
Yeah,
right?
right. While taller trees are statistically at higher risk, any tree close to a structure or in a frequently used area could benefit from a properly installed system. And it's also important to remember that a lightning protection system isn't a one-time fix. It needs to be installed correctly by a professional and then regularly inspected and maintained to make sure it's working properly.
Right, so it's an ongoing commitment. So let's talk about some really practical advice. How can our listeners, just by walking around their property, spot those potential time bomb trees, the ones that might be at risk of failing? What should they be looking for?
There are several telltale signs that a tree might be structurally compromised. First off, look for any significant cracks in the trunk or major branches, especially if they're large, deep, or widening over time.
Okay, crack's bad. What else?
Also, any noticeable leaning of the tree is a concern, particularly if it's developed suddenly or seems to be getting worse. Then check for signs of root damage, things like large exposed or broken roots, or any lifting or heaving of the soil around the base of the tree.
Okay, got it.
Another red flag is dead or dying branches in the upper canopy, as well as any areas of visible decay, fungal growth, or hollows on the trunk or major limbs. And finally, if a tree has a history of dropping limbs unexpectedly, or if it's been struck by lightning before, it's definitely worth getting a professional arborist to take a look.
So keep your eyes peeled for those warning signs. Sounds like regular observation of your trees is crucial, especially in a place like Durban with its wild weather. Now, finally, our sources mention a storm readiness score checklist that listeners can download. What's that all about?
Yeah, the Storm Readiness Score checklist is a really handy tool for homeowners. It's basically a self-assessment that walks you through a series of questions and observations about the health structure and surrounding environment of the trees on your property.
So you can kind of get a sense of your own risk level.
Exactly. By working through the checklist, you can identify any potential problems that might need further investigation by a qualified arborist. It's a proactive way to evaluate how prepared you are for a storm when it comes to your trees.
That's awesome. So to recap everything we've covered today, we've highlighted the specific high-risk areas in Durban based on things like soil type, salt exposure, and aging tree populations. We debunked that whole aggressive storm prep trimming thing.
Please don't do that.
Right. We talked about what lightning protection systems really do and don't do. We named those three most common high-risk tree species. And we pointed you, our listeners, that Storm Readiness Score checklist as a great tool to assess your own situation. It's been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It really has. And now the most important thing is for you, our listeners in Durban, to take this information and apply it to your own surroundings. Go for a walk around your property, look up at those trees with this new understanding. What do you see?
What do you see? Yeah, that's a great point.
Right.
Because these trees aren't just part of the scenery, they're a vital part of our ecosystem. They provide shade and beauty, but as we've discussed, they can also pose risks, especially as we face more extreme weather events. So think about the long-term implications of climate change for Durban's urban forest. What actions can we take not just for the trees in our own backyards, but maybe as a community, to ensure the safety and resilience of our green spaces for years to come? It's something we all need to be thinking about.
I couldn't agree more.